It's been over a year since I promised to make a video covering specific types of Chawan, but it's finally time. Sorry for the wait. I was originally planning on doing this series in chronological order, but researching Temoku sent me down a very deep rabbit hole as contemporary research has changed how we should think and talk about these bowls, but more about that in its dedicated video. In this series, we'll take a deep look at some of the most important, interesting, and popular styles of chawan or matcha bowls. We'll look at their history, how they were developed, how they're made, what defines them, as well as examine some of the most famous surviving examples of each style, as well as look at the way that these bowls are continued to be produced and enjoyed today. First up, we'll be looking at Korean slipware chawan, specifically Mishima, Hakeme, and Kohiki techniques. These are perhaps some of Korea's most well-known and popular ceramic styles, but for today we'll be looking at them mostly through the lens of Japanese tea culture. One, because that's what we do on this channel, we talk about Japanese tea and tea culture. Two, it is because of this Japanese tea culture that many of these styles were preserved and continue to be popular to this day. Before we dive into each style specifically, let's first talk about why Korean ceramics are an important part of Japanese tea culture in the first place. I'll try and keep this history section short, but if you've seen this channel before, you know that's not going to happen. I plan on doing a much deeper dive on this part of history and Japanese tea history in general in my upcoming revised History of Tea in Japan series, so subscribe if you want to see that when I'm done with it. It'll happen, I promise. Anyway, here's the short version. Tea and tea culture were introduced to Japan from China, and as such, all of the teaware and tea implements used to make tea were typically either imported from China or made locally in Japan to mimic the ones that came from China. Chief among these, of course, being the Temoku Chawan, again, different episode. From the 800s through to the 1500s, this Chinese aesthetic dominated the tea culture in Japan, especially for the wealthy nobles and warrior class who had the money to afford Chinese antiques, and of course also for the Zen temples who had direct links through China. But even then, the street peddlers who were selling matcha on the street in front of the temples were still using bowls and teaware modeled off of this Chinese aesthetic. The movement away from the extravagant Chinese aesthetic first began in the late 1400s with the earliest beginnings of wabi-cha, or wabi tea. The most famous figure associated with this early stage of wabi-cha is Murata Juko of Nara. The aesthetic philosophy of wabi is a deep and nuanced subject for another time, but for our purposes here today, it represents a break from the extravagance and decorations of Chinese aesthetics and an embrace of a more natural beauty. The humble, the imperfect, the cold, the withered, the beauty of things that try to achieve perfection but fail to do so. An example of this is Juko himself preferring defective, dull yellow celadon instead of the perfect, glorious jade color that celadon is usually known for. This break from Chinese tradition opened the door for tea enthusiasts to use whatever implements and teaware suited their own personal tastes, and this is one of the reasons that wabi-cha became so popular. Rustic Korean ceramics, which were imported into Japan in relatively small numbers at this point, soon began to encapsulate this new wabi aesthetic. Compared to the rigidity and formality of the earlier Temoku and celadon wares from China, these Korean ceramics had much looser forms, more expressionistic glazes, and naturalistic imperfections, meaning they are much more suited to this new wabi-cha movement. Wabi-cha's early popularity was mostly centered in the city of Sakai, which today is practically a suburb of Osaka, but back in the 1500s, it was an independent, autonomous port town, and perhaps one of the richest towns in all of Japan. In fact, reports from European visits to Sakai in the 15 and 1600s likened the town to the Venice of Japan, filled with wealthy merchants making their money off of trade. These merchants would have had access to Korean ceramics, as Sakai was one of the ports where ships from Korea would have sold their wares. One of these rich merchant families, the Matsuya, began to keep a record of the tea parties they were holding, called the Matsuya Kaiki, and it is in this record, in an entry from 1537, that the first ever Korean tea bowl used to drink matcha in Japan was mentioned. Ta-da! Since there was no mention of Korean ceramics at all in the Kundai Kanso Choki, which is a manual of tea decoration and a ranking of ceramics, and written in the late 1400s to early 1500s, we can be reasonably sure that the early 1500s, around 1537, was actually the first time that these bowls began to be used. David from the editing table here, and I just wanted to share something that I found recently while researching for a video on tenmoku. This is a section from the Sagawa family documents, and it is an entry on tea utensils and teaware. And all of this preceding section is talking about daisu and tenmoku, and most of it seems like it's actually lifted straight from the Kundai Kanso Choki. And here at the end, at the colophon, we have the date, Dai Sannen, and the author who transmitted it, Soju. Soju is one of the disciples of Murata Juko, and Dai Sannen is 1523. Now the next section has right here an entry for Korai Chawan, Korean tea bowls. And following the name, we have some information about the dimensions of some specific Korai Chawan. Now what's not clear is if this next section, which also contains information about tenmoku that seems more or less straight lifted from the Kundai Kanso Choki, also bears relation to the same date and colophon as the preceding section. If it does, that means it's also transmitted in 1523, which would then push back the date of Korean Chawan usage in Japan by about 10 years. Is this a really tiny nerdy detail that I probably didn't need to include? Yes, but I thought it was interesting. Anyway, back to the video. In the Matsuya record, the bowl is referred to as a Korai Chawan, and this is still how we refer to these bowls today in Japanese. Korai is the Japanese reading of the Korean word Goryo, which is the name of the Korean dynasty from 918 to 1392. Coincidentally, this is also where we get the name Korea in English. Goryo, Korai, Korea. Even though by the early 1500s the Goryeo dynasty had collapsed and been replaced by the Joseon, people in Japan were still using the word Korai. These early Korean Chawan included some of the most famous styles, such as Iro Chawan, Komogai Chawan, Okugorai Chawan, and today's topic, the Mishima, Hakeme, and Kohiki Chawan. As best we can tell, these early Korean tea bowls were actually made in Korea for purposes other than drinking tea, probably for food, rice, or sake and wine. The practice of recontextualizing and readapting things made for other purposes to be used in the tea ceremony is a practice known as mitate, and it has become a staple of tea ceremony aesthetics. As wabi-cha's popularity exploded in the 1500s, so did demand for Korean tea bowls. In the Yamanoue Sojiki, a 1588 treatise on tea written by Yamanoue Soji, one of Rikyu's disciples, he writes, "Regarding tea bowls in general, Chinese tea bowls have now been set aside. In our times, it is Korean tea bowls, imayaki and setoyaki bowls that are used." In just 40 years, the entire scene of Japanese tea culture had shifted drastically, from the Chinese aesthetic moving to the Korean and domestic Japanese aesthetics. This explosion in popularity of Korai Chawan quickly outpaced the small supply, so starting in the late 1500s, teaists in Japan started drafting designs for tea bowls, sending these off to kilns in Busan in Korea, and having them come back as made-to-order bowls, known as Gohon Chawan. Gohon literally means the book. This references the book that the designs were written in and sent off. Confusingly, today, Gohon is often applied to a glaze effect, but originally it meant bowls that were made to order by tea ceremony practitioners in Japan to be made in Korea. During the Japanese invasions of Korea in 1592 and later in 1597, Korean potters were captured and brought back to Japan, where they were instructed to make Korean-style pottery in Japan, and this led to the creation of things like hagiyaki, karatsuyaki, and a few others. These regions continued to produce Korean-style pottery in Japan to this day. Now with this in mind, let's look at the story again, this time from the other side, from the perspective of Korean ceramics. During the Goryeo period, the most esteemed style of pottery was celadon. At its peak in the 12th century, Korean celadon was known for its beautiful jade green color, and its very intricate and beautiful inlay technique. These inlay patterns featured motifs like flowers or flying cranes among the clouds, and this inlay technique, known as zogan in Japanese or sangam in Korean, became a hallmark of Korean pottery moving forward. These celadons became the official court ceramics of the Goryeo dynasty, but as this dynasty began to wane, so did the quality and production of their celadons. Eventually, the production of celadon practically died out entirely at the beginning of the Joseon period, the next period in Korean history. Instead, the new Joseon elite preferred the pure white of porcelain, and in 1466 they released an edict saying that these kilns must produce porcelain for the imperial court, and no other kilns in Korea are allowed to produce porcelain. As such, the remaining kilns in Korea began to experiment with new wares to produce for the general populace. Though Goryeo celadon was no longer being produced, many of its styles and techniques were being carried on in this new style of Korean ceramics, which has become known as buncheong. This is a relatively new term, and it is used to describe all of these new types of Korean ceramics being made in the 14 to 1500s. As these were everyday ceramics intended for the general populace and not for the imperial court, the emphasis switched to speed, practicality, and efficiency, leading to an evolution of these earlier techniques. The vibrant green of celadon required really thick glazes and incredibly long firing times, so this technique quickly gave way to thinner glazes, almost half as thin, and much shorter firing times, which made the color a sort of dull bluish gray instead of the vibrant green. Similarly, the precise inlay techniques of the earlier celadon evolved into faster, more expressive, more efficient alternatives, and one of these was white slip inlay. More on that in a moment. As white porcelain continued to reign supreme in the imperial court of Korea, buncheongware responded by using increasing amounts of this white slip, creating wares that began to look closer to white porcelain. Neither the intricate celadon or the pure white porcelain were of any interest to the tea practitioners in Japan, but instead was this expressionistic buncheongware that became highly coveted, and it is where the three styles I have here today originate. Buncheong's heyday lasted less than a century and a half, put to an end both by the aforementioned invasions from Japan, but also due to the shift towards white porcelain. While buncheong aesthetics were continued in Japan up until this day, they more or less died out in Korea up until very recently, where they have received a bit of a revival. And that brings us to the present day and to what I have here on the table: Japanese ceramics made in a short-lived Korean style. That's the history. That's about as short as I could make it. I'm going to need a bowl of tea. With that history in mind, let's take a closer look at each of these three buncheong styles, with the first up being Mishima. In modern usage, Mishima refers to a decorative technique known as slip inlay, developed in Korea in the 1400s. Much like the inlaid celadon that preceded it, designs would be carved, etched, or stamped into the clay, but instead of using clay to make the inlay, the entire piece is coated in white slip. Slip is a type of liquid clay. Once the slip had dried, the excess was either scraped or wiped off, revealing the designs underneath, inlaid with white slip. Hence the term slip inlay. Finally, the piece is finished with a translucent ash or feldspar-based glaze. In Korea, this inlay technique is simply called sangam or inlay. Common designs include incised lines, geometric patterns, or stamped flowers, known as inka in Japanese or inhwa in Korean. Along with Edo Chawan, Mishima were among the first to enter Japan. Since the earliest record of Korean Chawan in Japan simply says Korean Chawan, we can't exactly be sure when they were being used, but it's probably in the early to mid 1500s. The earliest Mishima Chawan are called Ko Mishima, meaning Old Mishima. That makes sense, that's pretty straightforward. These were made in Korea for purposes other than tea, for food or wine. It's not clear when they were first produced, but probably sometime in the early to mid 1400s. It was Mishima that was one of the direct successors of the earlier celadon. The green glaze gave way to the sort of dull blue, and the inlay technique became much simpler and more expressive. However, the vast majority of Mishima Chawan that became popular in Japan were the later made-to-order Mishima Chawan, the Gohon Mishima Chawan, and there can be quite a difference between the earlier styles and the later styles. The earlier komishima bowls tended to have much more intricate and complex designs. One common motif is sometimes called the rope curtain. That's the sort of vertical pattern you can see here or on this bowl. These squiggly vertical lines were said to resemble the cursive writing on the calendars made at the Mishima shrine, and thus the name Mishima was applied to these bowls. In fact, another early name for these bowls was koyomide, or calendar style, but that name didn't quite catch on. These komishima chawan had much looser and heavier applications of the white slip, and not all of it was removed, so the designs became a little more clouded and obscured by the white slip. The overall effect was for a much brighter colored bowl, and the clay used was this really dark gray, which contrasted really nicely with the bright white slip. As the original komishima chawan weren't purpose-made matcha bowls, their shapes often differed a little bit from the ideal or standard shape of a matcha bowl. Sometimes they were quite flat or had these really pronounced lips. There are two famous surviving examples of this style, the Nitoku Mishima, which was owned and used by Sen no Rikyu, and the Ueda Mishima, or the Ueda Koyomide, which was owned by Ueda Soko. If you know anything about me and what T-school I practice, you know which one is my favorite. To answer that question, here for my personal collection is a pretty faithful replica of the Ueda Mishima. This one was made by Albert Tayo. The original bowl, now in the Nezu Museum in Tokyo, was made in Jeongsan in South Korea and was brought to Japan by Ueda Soko himself during these invasions of Korea in the 1590s. He was a samurai, a military commander, and he went to Korea, found this antique bowl and said, "I'm taking this one back home with me." It is an exquisite example of this older style of Mishima with a heavy application of white slip and really intricate, complex designs. There are many sub-variations of this komishima category, such as the Reihin Mishima. These were seen as the most refined and intricate and were used by government officials in Korea. Another style is the Sansaku style, meaning three techniques, in which Mishima was combined with Hakeme and Kohiki. More on those in a bit. The later made-to-order Mishima, made about a century after the originals, had much simpler designs. The first among these are the so-called Hori Mishima, or carved Mishima. These are named because the outside of the bowl is covered exclusively in carved diagonal lines. This pattern is sometimes called higaki, or cypress fencing in Japanese. The inside of these Hori Mishima bowls also had this cypress fencing design, along with some stamped flowers. Compared to the earlier Komishima, these later Mishima bowls had much cleaner, crisper designs, with very little excess slip remaining on the surface. The clay used was often a warmer brown than the earlier gray, and the glaze was a bit of a greenish blue color. Sometimes it was thicker, leading to a general gray color to the bowls, and sometimes it was thinner, allowing for the brown of the clay to show through. Later editions of these made-to-order Mishima bowls differed slightly from the Hori Mishima, starting to put the flowers on the outside or to incorporate other techniques such as Hakeme and Mishima, or even some of the earlier Komishima designs. As all of these made-to-order bowls were ordered specifically as matcha bowls, their shapes were a lot more uniform and closer to the standard ideal bowl shape. Most of these were made in kilns close to the city of Busan for easy export to Japan. As so many of these were made, many of them survive to this day, one of the famous examples being Kimura. Held at the Tokyo National Museum, this bowl displays both the carved lines and the stamped flowers, as well as the blue-green tint to the transparent glaze that contrasts with the warm brown clay. After the Busan kilns closed in 1718, this style continued to be produced in Japan. As the designs continued to evolve, they increasingly adapted other styles from buncheong ware such as Kohiki and Hakeme. This chawan by Nakamura Yohei places the stamped flowers on the outside of the bowl. This was relatively rare in the early days, and the bowls that did have it on the outside were much more expensive than those that had the stamped flowers on the inside. Underneath these stamped flowers, we have these squiggly lines. Once again, this is the rope pattern or the calendar pattern from the earlier Komishima bowls. On the inside, we have a brushstroke, which I'll get to in a second. On this Minoyaki cup, the majority of the white slip is done in the other styles. This is closer to Kohiki and Hakeme, but at the bottom we have a lot of very cute little stamped flowers, and this is the Mishima. In this way, Mishima has become more of an element of design. This slip inlay technique is being combined with other decorative styles. This adorable mug and saucer set by Ito Noriaka shows the confluence of the stamped flowers with the heavy slip application that is more famous in Komishima. The piece is thoroughly covered in the later stamped flower technique, but the heavy application of slip gives it an air of the earlier Komishima, especially because of the contrasting grey base. Wares that are exclusively decorated with flowers are sometimes called hana mishima, literally meaning flower mishima. This chawan that we commissioned by Sugawara Kengo very closely captures the aesthetic and colors and textures of the Hori Mishima chawan, with the varying thicknesses of the translucent glaze over the warm clay, giving it both shades of gray and green and brown. The inside has all three of the major design styles. We have the carved diagonal lines of Hori Mishima. This is the cypress fencing. We have the sort of vertical dots. This is the calendar style once again. And at the bottom, we have the stamped flowers, or inka. The outside also features a brushstroke, which brings us to our next technique, Hakeme. Hakeme, meaning brushstroke, also known as guial in Korean, is another slip decoration technique that was developed at the same time and probably at the same kilns as Mishima. Here, white slip is simply applied with a coarse brush or hake, which leaves behind visible strokes that are quite expressive. The Hakeme technique was especially popular in earlier buncheong ware, especially on vases, where it was used to produce a white base to support other designs. This early Hakeme seems to merely be a functional way of applying slip to a piece, with the visible brushstrokes being more of a naturalistic happy accident. When the white slip is brushed across the entire piece, making it almost entirely white, it is called muji hakeme, or plain hakeme. Since porcelain was banned for commoners in Korea at this point in time, this was probably a way to create white wares that looked like porcelain, but weren't porcelain. Therefore, you could sell them. The original Hakeme bowls belong to the first generation of Korai Chawan, those made in Korea for domestic consumption, usually for things other than tea. But like with Mishima Chawan, a lot of the later ones were made to order by Japanese tea practitioners. These later bowls tended to use Hakeme more as a decorative style than simply a way of applying white slip to a bowl. As such, the strokes of the brush became much coarser, and there was a lot more bare clay being shown to show off the rustic nature of these brush strokes. As time wore on, this became even more extreme, and sometimes the brush strokes became limited to a single stroke, sort of applying the Zen enso to pottery. Through its history, Hakeme was often combined with Mishima, because after all, brushing was how the slip got on there in the first place. Once again, this bowl by Nakamura Yohei has a single brushstroke, very much in the Enso style. This one by Sugawara Kengo, again, has the brushstroke on the outside, and it is also a single stroke. It's a bit hard to see, but it starts here and wraps around in one go and ends over here. This lovely, squishy Echizen-yaki chawan from my personal collection has a more traditional application of Hakeme, being sort of all over and less deliberately expressive. Here's an example of a food bowl, also made by Sugawara Kengo, using the one-stroke style of Hakeme. If this were produced in Korea in the 1500s, I bet you someone in Japan would have used it as a matcha bowl. Our last style, and one of my personal favorites, was another way of producing imitation porcelain, and that is Kohiki. Like Mishima and Hakeme, Kohiki, meaning powder-coated, is another traditional Korean style of slipware that dates back to the short-lived buncheong ceramics of the 15th century. In another attempt to make an affordable imitation of baekja porcelain, which was the type being used by the elite Joseon court, wares made from an iron-rich clay were dipped entirely, often more than once, in the white slip, covering the entire piece. Once again, the piece is finished with a translucent ash glaze. In Korean, this slip dipping technique is known as dommongi. When being dipped, the balls are held by the foot, usually by 3 fingers. This leaves behind 3 little dots where the fingers blocked the slip from touching the clay, and these are known as yubi ato, or finger marks in Japanese. The practice of coating the entire piece is called so gusuri, or total glazing. This is what sets Kohiki apart from the early Muji Hakeme, because in the Muji Hakeme, only the top, except for the foot, is covered with slip. The final effect is a warm, soft, organic white, as if the bowl had been covered with white powder, hence the name. Compared to Muji Hakeme, Kohiki produces wares that are a little closer to looking like real porcelain. But one of the downsides is that because the entire bowl is covered in slip, there is no way for the glaze to actually interact with the clay, because the slip is in the way. And this makes Kohiki wares inherently more fragile and soft and porous than Muji Hakeme. The porous nature of Kohiki means that over time these bowls will develop a deep, rich patina as tea seeps into the slip and the glaze. If you give the same Kohiki bowl to 2 different people, they will age differently, reflecting how their owners use them. Additionally, depending on the glaze, firing schedule, slip, etc., some Kohiki wares can be so porous that the glaze actually absorbs water when you put it in there. This produces an effect called amamori, or rain-stained leaky roof. These usually disappear as the chawan dries, but over time they can become stained with tea, producing a beautiful effect. You can kind of see it here in this bowl, where the little dots have a sort of brownish ring around them. There are 3 very famous original Kohiki bowls in Japan, of which Miyoshi is my favorite. In fact, I love this bowl so much that I made an illustration of it that I put on our business cards, and also on our tote bag. It's also here on some of our matcha labels. This is Uji Hikari from Yoshida Meicha-en, and that was the tea I was drinking earlier. One of my favorites, along with this bowl. The original Miyoshi Chawan was at some point owned by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the shogun of Japan. That's a pretty high praise if you ask me. Miyoshi also presents a great example of one of the most popular decorations found on Kohiki Chawan, being the hima, or fire space. That is this diagonal line seen on this replica of the Miyoshi Chawan by Nakamura Yohei. This design is made by leaving a wedge of clay intentionally uncovered by slip. This was probably done accidentally at first, but over time it became a very popular decorative style. Another addition to this is the drop of slip that runs across the space, creating this 2-leveled design. Again, this is probably an accident at first, just a drop of slip stuck to someone's thumb that then dripped across the accidental space, but people thought it looked cool and started making them on purpose. It is said that the hima that go from top right to bottom left are made by potters holding the bowl in their left hand as they dip it. Conversely, those that go from top left to bottom right were made by people holding the bowl in their right hand. Here I have another replica of the Miyoshi Chawan. This one is from my personal collection. And you can see that it has been stained and patinaed with heavy use. As I mentioned earlier, starting in 1466, porcelain was reserved for the imperial household and banned for everyone else. In 1718, this restriction was relaxed, allowing imperial bureaucrats to use porcelain, and in 1720, commoners were finally allowed to use porcelain. By the mid-1800s, porcelain had become so popular that the production of Kohiki in Korea practically died out. But this style was still being produced in Japan, and while it was continued as a teaware style, it recently experienced a huge explosion as a popular style of tableware, as the warm, organic, soft white that it produces is a more naturalistic alternative to the harsh, cold white of industrially produced porcelain. That's kind of poetic, isn't it? Today, in addition to these replicas of Miyoshi, I have a sogusuri, or entirely glazed Kohiki Chawan by Sugawara Kengo, the same amazing potter who made that Mishima Chawan from earlier. This was another one that we commissioned from him, and once again, you can see the 3 spaces on the bottom where he held the bowl and dipped it into the slip. One of the highlights of Kohiki wares is when the clay peeks through under the white slip. The iron-rich clay that is traditionally used for kohiki turns this dark reddish brown when fired in the kiln, so it creates a beautiful contrast with the soft white slip. The same iron-rich clay is what is responsible for these little black specks. These are little clumps of iron that get drawn from the clay through the slip and appear on the surface, giving it a lovely little scenery. As per our commission, this bowl has a takenofushi kodai, giving it a very elegant appearance. Another common effect seen on kohiki wares is called gohon or gohonte. These are little brown or pink or beige specks that occur when parts of the clay are drawn through the surface and change color in the kiln, much in the same way that the black specks from earlier are formed. Except in this case, that you can see these little orange halos around white spots. Gohon refers again to this made-to-order Chawan practice, and this is because a lot of the Chawan that were made to order came back with these little pink and beige spots, so the name stuck. This tokonamiyaki kohiki Chawan has an even more pronounced beige Gohon effect. The consistency and composition of the slip along with the firing can affect the final color of the glaze. In here it is a bright white, but in this Chawan it's a bit more of a soft gray. You can also see that where the slip is thinner, more of the brown clay shows through, making it a sort of a darker, duller color. But that adds a lot of texture and dimension to the bowl. The translucent glaze on this hagiyaki kohiki Chawan has actually turned the lip this sort of bluish green color as it was fired in reduction. And on this delightfully squished bowl, the very thin slip has led to all of these dripping patterns across the piece. This is just a small taste of the variety of wares that can be produced using these three basic slipware techniques, and an even smaller glimpse at the vast world of Korean Chawan. So if you want to see more videos diving excessively deep into singular styles of tea bowls, let me know in the comments down below. Also, let me know which of the tea bowls on display today was your favorite. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss my next 3-hour lecture about ceramics. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.